Welcome to Underworlds from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. My name is Mark Shaw, and in today's episode I'm speaking to Miles Johnson, who's written a book called Chasing Shadows, which looks at the interlay or overlays between organized crime, politics, and terrorism, and looking at the money flows and the individuals involved. It traces the story of three characters and uses those characters to shine a light on the intersections between these different areas. And now, over to the conversation. Miles, welcome to Underworlds. Here's a copy of Miles's book, which I read while traveling, and I have to say it was just a real thriller. Keeps you on the edge of your seat as you move through all the different characters, Miles. So well done, and it's really a pleasure to be speaking to you.
Thank you.
And I perhaps a good way to start, Miles, is just to ask you to sketch out the big themes of the book. Because there's a lot of people in the book and there's a lot of movement and there's a lot of action. But what would you say are the big themes that emerge for you?
Well, firstly, Mark, thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And really thank you for reading and enjoying the book. It is a book which, as you say, there's a lot of characters in it, so to speak. I mean, these are real people, but they're people whose lives are presented in the book. But they all interact with each other in this sort of thematic way, in the sense of it's a very global book. It's a book where there are characters based in different locations, and unlike sort of I guess classic kind of sort of cinematic true crime thing where all the characters eventually sort of end up in a room, these are characters who their lives are affected by one another, but through the sort of global criminal sort of economy. And it's really a story thematically about the globalization of organized crime, but also how geopolitics shapes organized crime and criminal activity across borders. And so how unexpected events in one country will lead to unexpected events in another. And how these are sort of these very powerful forces which can't really be controlled very easily by states or governments. And often they actually devour the protagonists in the book themselves. They're too powerful for the criminals themselves to deal with.
I mean, it's really a fascinating story. I mean, you make the point, these three guys don't actually meet each other, but they are sort of intersecting in this broader political criminal economy. Just give us a quick sketch of the three, because they're quite interesting set of men, I have to say.
Yeah, so I would begin with Jack Kelly, who is a US DEA agent, and he is drafted into a unit of the DEA called Special Operations Division. And it's a sort of part of the DEA, which is almost like a sort of processing house for a lot of the information that's coming in from sources around the world. And he's specifically put on looking at money laundering related to the Middle East, specifically Lebanon and Hezbollah, the sort of political party, militant organization, designated terrorist organization. And so this is a guy who his experience is as a street level sort of drug agent. He's worked in places like New York and other places in the United States, and he's suddenly put into this world which is completely different, where he has to sort of apply similar strategies to fighting sort of domestic or city level organized crime. But he's applying it to a very, very different sort of target. He sort of follows money effectively. And then they sort of, with the DEA, they pick targets and build up sort of operations against particularly important criminals. He comes into, so basically that's how he sort of comes into the story. But the next sort of character that I focus on is someone very, very far away. He's a Mafia kind of captain, I guess, in Calabria. So the Calabrian Mafia, the Ndrangheta, are sort of a very, very powerful criminal organization and sort of largely sort of replaced the power of the Sicilian Mafia in the 90s and became very, very wealthy from cocaine trafficking. And my second character is a man called Salvatore Petito, who he is not a top boss. He is a sort of, the Ndrangheta is organized around families, and he is a member of a sort of lower level family, not one of the top crime families in Calabria, but he is an aspirational criminal. He is someone who has watched the families around him become vastly rich and powerful and feared through cocaine trafficking, because the Ndrangheta has proven extremely adept at forging close relationships with Latin American cartels. And he effectively, at the start of our story, Salvatore decides to risk everything to pull off a vast transatlantic cocaine deal. And to do that, he has to interact with money launderers who are based out of the Middle East, who Jack Kelly is investigating. And that brings us to our last character, so to speak, who is a man called Mustafa Badruddin. And he is a sort of legendary and extremely deadly and violent master bomb maker who has worked in the orbit of Hezbollah. He's eventually recognized as a sort of Hezbollah figure, but who he always works for is unclear over his career. But he has an extremely long career, decades, starting out from his early 20s, his teens, where he's pulled off a series of extremely violent and bloody terrorist attacks in Lebanon. And in 2016, he is now middle-aged, almost at retirement, has been dispatched to Syria because Hezbollah has become involved in the Syrian civil war, defending the Assad regime. And Mustafa is dispatched there as effectively his commander in Syria. Now, how does that interact with the other two characters? That's because there are these money laundering cells that Jack Kelly and the DEA is investigating, who he suspects are laundering cocaine money in Europe and sending it to the Middle East to fund Hezbollah's extremely expensive incursion into Syria, where Mustafa is commanding. So that the money is what sort of connects these characters together in that sense.
Miles, it's sort of this triangle of three characters. Can I ask, did you know them separately at different times? Did you come across one? When did you make the connection between the three? Give us some background how you stumbled on the three and then you sort of pulled together the story, which is very character driven, makes it very interesting. Just some background I think would be really helpful.
Yes. So I was working, I work for the Financial Times. I'm an investigative reporter, but I've also worked as a foreign correspondent. About 3 or 4 years ago, I was working as the Rome correspondent for the FT. And I was covering a lot of stuff like politics and the economy and society, but I was also covering organized crime from a particular angle. So I was looking at the Italian organized criminal groups had become quite financially sophisticated. They started to sort of intersect into the world of high finance and sort of laundering their money through complicated financial products and various scams. And so that was sort of my way into it. And I started reading a lot of indictments and speaking to a lot of prosecutors and financial police and stuff like that. And I started to come across various cases, and people were sort of telling me, what you've got to look at is not just where the cases end, because frequently the Italian anti-mafia police do amazing work. They prosecute these huge sprawling indictments involving hundreds of people sometimes. But there are sometimes elements of those cases when they leave the borders of Italy where they stop, because they just simply can't, they can't chase someone into Brazil frequently, or figure out where all the money has gone around the whole world. It's just not really practical. With their main focus, obviously, organized criminals in Italy. And so there was this one case where there was this very interesting figure involved, where the money was sort of sent through a figure who was from Lebanon, who was connected into this network, which the DEA had sort of investigated, which was really present across Europe. So there was this quite important money laundering network in Europe operating in France, in Spain, in Belgium, in Germany, in Italy. And I started to sort of look more at that network and sort of follow the trail of money and see, get into the indictment in the United States. Look at basically different elements of this case, and that's sort of how I started to got into contact with Jack Kelly, and then Jack Kelly is this extremely impressive investigator. And had really very interesting conversations with him, and I started to see the whole broader context of why this money laundering operation was in existence in the first place, which was obviously very dependent on the geopolitical situation of the time and the extremely awful and bloody and complex conflict in Syria.
Also, I mean, you started in Italy and sort of then completed the triangle through that route. Tell us something about Kelly. I mean, he was clearly open to being interviewed for talking. The description of his frustrations, of the bureaucracy, the wider bureaucracy, the sort of turf battles in the U.S. government. I mean, what kind of individual is he like? Was he eager to talk? Was he surprised to be approached?
I think, he is someone who's extremely passionate about his work. I mean, he's now retired, but he was really someone who is a bit of an obsessive. He really would sometimes spend every waking hour on his work, and was and so passionate about it. I think, he was he could understand that I was coming to him, sort of respectfully to try and better understand really what happened in a situation which is very complex and hard to explain to a general audience. And I think he wanted to engage on a level where we would discuss it in a way which was intelligible to a general audience. But that said, it's also, it's a complicated story, and it also doesn't always have the elements of a story which you would see in a film. Part of really what I was trying to do with the book was trying to give a portrait of how chaotic and sprawling modern transnational criminal organizations and networks are. Because they don't neatly fit into, there's not sort of frequently, there's not just sort of one guy at the top who sort of controls absolutely everything, and it's like a sort of Scarface-esque character. There's often interacting networks and different power structures and things which cross borders and get quite messy. And what Jack's job really was to do was to sort of sit in, his office at the DEA and receive this vast amount of information and sort of trying to make sense of it. So I thought he was a fantastically interesting character to show the difficulties and sometimes even the futility of trying to make sense of this ocean of illicit activity across borders.
Martin, what's so interesting is Kelly clearly has competition in the system. There are others who have different interpretations. The DEA has a particular place in the firmament of the security agencies of the US. So how does he operate? I mean, he showed clearly his frustrations to you of trying to sell his and their interpretation of what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, I found that really fascinating in the sense that there's a sort of a philosophical, the DEA is technically part of the US intelligence community, but it obviously is a law enforcement agency. Its job is to get convictions. That's what it does. Whereas, an intelligence agency does not care about criminal convictions in the same way. So there's a sort of philosophical difference. It was just really interesting to see where increasingly in the world, there is this intersection between national security threats and transnational criminal threats, sort of weird sort of hybrid actors. Someone I was writing a lot about last year was, Yevgeny Prigozhin of the Wagner Group, who was designated as a transnational criminal organization by the US, but is also obviously sort of national security, a guy of national security interest, running a master organization, et cetera, in Ukraine. So there's this sort of weird places where this stuff crosses over, especially, in terrorist fundraising. But there is this big clash of philosophies, where if you're an intelligence agency, you want to observe targets, you want to build information, you want to maintain good sources. You might find, and frequently people did, an agency like the DEA coming in and arresting people and staging sting operations abroad problematic or annoying. It can act contrary to your interest. And so it was very illuminating for me to sort of, I spoke to a lot of people in a lot of different sort of organizations and in different countries, and sort of tried to build up a pretty good picture of, because a lot of these operations, they would involve police from countries in Europe or, other agencies from around the world. And there's a lot of characters involved, and everyone had a sort of slightly different perspective, depending on where they sat, but they definitely agreed on one thing, that there were a lot of clashes.
Well, you mentioned that you conducted a lot of interviews, you're reaching out to people. I mean, give us a sense of how you do it. These are people who don't necessarily want to speak. Either they're in state security organizations or they're in criminal organizations. Do you just call them up? What do you say? If you do you reach out through intermediaries? All of the above? I mean, are there any tricks you think that you use to get people to talk? And then do you build a relationship with them? Clearly, in the case of Kelly, it appears that you did. I mean, just give us what did it take to get the sources to write the book? I know that's within your wider reporting as well, but just in terms of building this enormous number of interviews, which then pulls the story together, your approach and perhaps your frustrations around doing some of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was a big challenge, and I think I'd say what I like as a reporter, where I feel comfortable always is, there's a foundational sort of document trail to whatever I'm doing, which I can use as a sort of architecture to build, to identify who I should be approaching to talk to. So, frequently in this book, there were a lot of different criminal cases, dating over, 30 years. There were also all sorts of other sorts of, there was a UN tribunal evidence, and, different documents from different agencies, documents from Colombian agencies or Czech agencies. And, there were so many. And it gives you, that gives you a sort of firm footing to then think like, okay, well, who was working there at the time? Or, in an indictment, these people were named, frequently, you begin by sort of, in the case of criminals, often they're in prison, in many instances, or dead, or fugitives. So they're difficult to contact for sure. And, we obviously have to be sort of, we want to give people the, right, the most basic level, just the right to reply and to make an effort to contact them. And so that could be through their lawyers, or that sometimes people do actually want to talk. Sometimes people surprisingly want to talk. And there's obviously a lot of, there are contentious issues, and sometimes people feel like they haven't been heard or portrayed fairly. So it's a sort of, it's a process of exploration where you sort of map out your universe, and you try and get in contact with people, sometimes who are impossible to get in contact with, sometimes who you think are impossible, but actually somehow you find them, and you are just trying to be straightforward and honest, and explain what you're doing and what you want to talk about.
Also, in that process, was there a moment of like extreme frustration for you? Somebody not replying, some sort of key part of the story not coming together? Was there that kind of time period in which you thought, my goodness, I need to get this or this document or this person? Or was it sort of fitting together over time?
There are always some complicated issues relating to the status of criminal cases, when you're in different jurisdictions, and when you're, it's a kind of quite technical thing, but just, sometimes things can be under appeal for many, many years, and it can complicate the process of reporting on them. I mean, you have to sort of get lucky as well. Sometimes there were documents, and I didn't think I was going to be able to get hold of, which I did. And then those led me to being able to contact people who I didn't think I was ever going to be able to reach. But no, I mean, it's there was interesting elements to this because, especially, for example, in the Mafia strand of the story. So in the Salvatore story, the Ndrangheta are quite, because they are family-based units. It's not sort of top-down structure. It's different kind of families who operate in a sort of constellation of crime families, and they're very hard for law enforcement to penetrate because frequent, organized crime groups are based on sort of blood and marriage, are sort of less likely to betray each other, basically. And so historically, it's been hard to have, what in Italian called pentiti, like sort of people who become state witnesses and stuff like that. But in the case of Salvatore's family, there are actually a relatively large number of people who had become state witnesses over time. And some of them, so there were sort of, I was using two, and that meant that they gave a vast amount of testimony. They sit down with a prosecutor and they do interviews, going on for hours and hours and hours, which, I got hold of those interviews. And so that gives you a sort of a very different way into understanding a world and personalities and motivations than, a sort of an indictment, for example, because you have people sort of talking about often the sort of quite small details, the banalities of what they do. And, and in the case of Salvatore, he had a girlfriend, he was having an affair with a Ukrainian woman called Oksana, who is an important character in the book. And she became a state witness, and she, her perspective is extremely fascinating. Not only because, she's a woman in an extremely kind of chauvinistic and male-dominated environment, but she was not directly involved in crime. She's someone who she was aware of what was going on, but because Salvatore would come back home after a day's work, so to speak, he would sort of sit in her kitchen and he would unload about his day, about as maybe everyone would, you start talking about, this guy who owes me money, hasn't paid me any money, he's an idiot, or this person hasn't screwed up this deal, with this guy. So he's just sort of telling her all of his just frustrations of his life. But in the kitchen, the Italian financial police had put a sort of ambiental listening device. So you're just getting all of this stuff where they're watching TV. They'll be watching a show with, an action film with people running around with Kalashnikovs, and he just turns around to his girlfriend and says, "Oh, I've got 2 Kalashnikovs." And she goes, "Oh, that's really interesting." I was like, it's just this sort of these strange moments, which add a sort of texture to. They're not sort of legally important, but they paint the sort of universe that these people live in, where the sort of the fact of the normality of that sort of thing, which would be quite shocking to anyone else. So yeah, it's always been a process of sort of building this picture through a mixture of documents and human sources that, luckily, over time, with a lot of effort, I got what I needed.
Thanks, Miles. Fascinating stuff. The other area which, reading it, I was really taken by, and I sense this was quite difficult, is that you have these 3 characters who don't know each other, who are at different time phases, and you've got to integrate them for the reader and bring linkages between them. So the chapters are moving to different parts of the world, to different incidents. I mean, tell us something about structuring that. And I sense in your acknowledgements, I think you don't say it directly, but some of the frustrations of writing that come out, and I can imagine what they are. It's really challenging. I mean, tell us what you were doing and what you were thinking, and how difficult was it?
Yeah, I mean, it was a real challenge. There were certainly times when I would sort of sit surrounded by massive amounts of Post-it notes and sort of scrawled notes and stuff, and be rather intimidated by the task I'd taken on. But I mean, I think it was this extremely delicate balance between telling telling, this is a true story. No detail is invented. Every piece of dialogue, every detail, if there's any description, if the color of a car, if it's red, that is the color of the car. There is if the time someone did something, that is a sort of an integral part of the work. But it means that you then also have a lot of details that you have to get rid of, because there's almost a sort of, in certain instances, this sort of strange thing where you actually have too much material. Because if you have, 5,000 pages of, wiretap transcripts or something, a lot of what people do in their daily lives is quite tedious. It's just boring stuff. You like go downstairs and put on the kettle and make a cup of tea and, say hello to somebody. This is not stuff. You have to be very selective in what you're including in the in each chapter, but then you're also having to be very mindful of not distorting what has actually happened, but then also just trying to be sort of careful about how you present the information, but in structurally, you're sort of thinking it's a little bit this is maybe a somewhat strange way to put it, but it's a little bit like if you were sort of editing an episode of reality TV in certain instances in the book. There are different things. Each part has been put together in a different way. As you said, the Jack Kelly section is much more about interviews and with him and also other people and documents as well. But in the sort of the Italian side of the story, you have this massive amount of material, including sort of, surveillance photographs, phone, like sort of location data, text messages, everything. And so you're sort of editing this live stream of a day in a criminal's life. And so that was a real challenge structurally. But it's also a sort of nature that I was very determined to not make this a story where, look, I have a vast amount of respect for law enforcement and the work they do, but I think it's a complex job, and I didn't want to just make it a story about, just goodies and baddies and just these great, and make it a sort of Hollywood style thing where, the goodies triumph in the end. Like, this is a messy world where, as Jack's story shows, people are fighting, they're doing something right. They're trying to fight for, but it's difficult. You come up against just bureaucratic obstacles or difficulties it's not just this simple process of just heroes coming in and, kicking ass, as they say. It was, I was quite determined that I would show the complexity of that. And also in terms of the ending of the story, that's an important, because this is not a world where anyone really walks away happily. This is not a place where everything is just perfectly resolved and, it's all over, crime has been solved, and the world is just a perfect place. This is a world where there's just this, people might be arrested, people will come and replace them. This is a world where the geopolitical forces which are, encouraging or fueling this activity will remain in place or change into something else. Or it's so in terms of the structure, I wanted to make it a book which was readable and relatable, but also something which accurately portrayed that world. And so that's why there's also a lot of focus on the incompetence of some of the characters as well.
It's amazing, actually, Miles, the degree to which geopolitics intervenes. There's a scene in the book. The US have been cooperating with the French, and then they're going to have a party to celebrate. And then suddenly the party's called off because, of course, politics has intervened. And I don't know, it's a very real story that full of grays and real people. I think that comes across really, really well.
Thank you.
I mean, you've given this fascinating overview of the amount of work that goes into a book like this. I'm very interested in this idea of nonfiction, true crime. Actually, the term true crime is sometimes a little bit frustrating, actually, because it fits into a specific part of the library or the bookshop or whatever. And in fact, perhaps I at least would want to make the argument that these books are more important for another reason. They're about the wider political economy of how the world works, how politics is influenced. I mean, do you have those kinds of frustrations? Why do you work and write in this area? What do you want to achieve?
Yeah, I think, as you say, true crime can be a problematic label, and it can kind of encompass a vast amount of different things. And what I sort of always wanted to do as a journalist and an author is to try and illuminate a little bit the sort of strange elements of the world, how they work, and things which often are very surprising. The world is a very strange place. It's a sort of huge cliche, but sometimes the truth can be stranger than fiction. People are absolutely stunned by some of these stories in that space. But I think it really interacts more also with things that people would consider kind of traditional non-fiction areas, like sort of geopolitics and history. These are understanding the way events in the world shape our surroundings. And I think in the case of this book, I was also very focused on trying to give an accurate depiction of this phenomenon to the point where it confounds certain expectations. So, in the sort of world of sort of narrativized crime, there are these expectations, especially in organized crime, of, these all-seeing, all-powerful bosses overseeing sort of very tightly run, centralized organizations, and everyone being actually really competent, the police being really competent, the criminals being really competent, and it all sort of working really quite well. And actually the reality is much more chaotic than that. And, in the book, there's a lot of scenes of criminals being just quite, incompetent and doing things for quite stupid reasons. And also just showing the sort of one thing which really unifies all of these characters is that they, my editor made a joke, which I think is very accurate, which is, he was sort of joking that this is also a book about middle management. This is a book about people who are in institutions who are just dealing with the sort of bureaucratic difficulties of being an institution, of being frustrated by the institution they're in, and people who've also devoted their lives in some way to the values and ideas of different institutions, be that US law enforcement or the Italian Mafia or Hezbollah, and ultimately those institutions betray them. This is not a book where everyone ends up super, happily living their life and vindicated. These are people who are often frustrated by the world they're in, and that applies across those institutions. So you see, a lot of the time, it's sort of the forces that these people are dealing with are bigger than them, and they're trying, like any human, to sort of somehow try and shape their own destiny and fate, in this sort of extremely, sort of like chaotic world they live in. And they come up against things which are too big and too powerful for them to really control. So in the simplest sense, just trying to organize from scratch a very audacious transatlantic cocaine shipment, you're trying to sort of wrest control of your own destiny and eventually failing. And so that was sort of what I was trying to capture, rather than the expectations of, sort of everything just being extremely slick and perfectly run and masterful.
As you've alluded to this, because I think what you're saying, some of this comes across in the conclusion, because it can't end neatly, because there are a lot of, I don't want to say loose ends, but in the grays of the world in which you are writing about, there aren't always happy stories or a clear resolution as you would have in a script written movie, so to speak. I mean, tell us something about this. Kelly doesn't go to his retirement party, or he misses it, or they hold it without him. Sort of a weird detail, which I thought said a lot about how a bureaucracy thanks you for working. I mean, the other cases, it also has these very unsatisfying endings, but illustrative of reality, life, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, no one really wins. I mean, I think Jack, is ultimately vindicated by sort of, I think, consensus moves closer towards what he had been arguing. But it's a sort of situation where at the end, maybe this is true of us all. At the end, when you retire, it's not sort of like, the screen doesn't fade to black and you walk off triumphantly to sort of a soundtrack, whether you're a criminal or in law enforcement or anything. I think there are, there's also just elements of age, I think, is another thing I find interesting in the book in comparison to the characters, where the way we are as human beings when we're 20 is going to be different to when we're 50. And in the case of, for example, Mustafa Badruddin, who has been, operating in this sort of shadowy existence, as a sort of ghost-like figure since he was 17, 18 or something. He's in his 50s, and does he still believe the same things that he did when he was 20? Is he still doing it for the same reasons? Is he happy with the direction which his organization has gone in? The same as the DEA agents who were doing these big international meaningful sting operations, generating a lot of attention and bringing in big targets. And so a lot of them were, I've spoken to a lot of them who were very disillusioned by the way the organization went sort of after sort of 2016, 17. And so, it's people who they change over time. I think that was another sort of part of the book, is just we tend to view people's motivations as quite static sometimes, especially in the sort of more ideological like prisms of sort of like, sort of things like terrorism and terrorist financing, why someone does something. They might do the same thing, but their reasons for doing it might change over time and over their life. And so I found that quite interesting. But really, these are people who, they don't. There is never going to be, as you say, there's never going to be a sort of happy ending, a perfect ending. No one ever comes into the end and says, "You were completely right. You're amazing." That maybe that happens once in a while, but for most people, that's not how it works. And that was certainly the case for these guys.
Miles, what has been the reaction to the book? I mean, you've been presenting it and talking about it. What do people say? And has any of that surprised you?
Yeah, I've been really encouraged by the reaction in the sense of I've had a lot of general readers. So basically I've had people contact me who are not people who are of a huge sort of interest in this area, who have related to the book as on its own terms, which has been very encouraging. I mean, I've had some interesting people contact me. I had one person who was a relative of a quite well-known organized crime figure who had left the family and contacted me to say that they related very strongly to the depiction of the family dynamic in the book, in the sort of Mafia side of the story. So that was very surprising and very interesting to hear.
Interesting. Miles, I think the Global Initiative. We're doing multiple research projects on organized crime, illicit economies, trying to push forward a discussion precisely on what you are doing to understand the underworld, if you like, or the illicit better. What can we do better? What does the book illustrate? What are there areas that deserve more attention? This connection, organized crime, terror financing that you've uncovered, is there areas in the broader research community from where you sit where things could just be better, where much more work is required?
I would say, look, I think the work you guys do is absolutely fantastic, and the people who collaborate with you too. I mean, I think I wouldn't say it's errors. It's I think it's just I think it's just a challenge for anyone who's looking at this area. It becomes more and more complicated. The world, it feels, especially the sort of, the world is becoming an ever more complicated place, which sounds like a little bit of a trite thing to say, but just in terms of the nature of the actors who we would be counting is as, of interest, and who they're interacting with. So I think one thing I've become really interested in, which is connected to this book, is the interaction between states, and regimes, governments which are hostile to the West, and organized criminal groups. And you've had these fascinating sort of interactions between effectively kind of like rogue states, sanctioned regimes, whatever you want to call them, and organized crime groups, and how I think that will become a very interesting. People have done interesting research in it, but I think that will become a more interesting area of research. In the context we're in. So in where you have these massive economies which are being sanctioned and cut off from the Western financial system, and how sanctions sort of effectively create a need for people to turn into the international black market. If you can't buy something on the open market anymore, you need to find someone to get it for you. And so I think the nature of these bizarre collaborations between unlikely characters, so there was this fascinating case in United States recently, earlier this year, involving Canadian Hells Angels being hired by the Iranian Foreign Intelligence Service to assassinate dissidents in the United States. Bizarre people you just never would think would be in the same room, so to speak, together. And I think that will be a really interesting continuing area of research, I guess, for us all.
What you're saying is there's plenty more material for you, Miles, to bring together these interesting characters. Really, really a pleasure to speak with you, and thanks for taking the time.
Oh, the pleasure is mine. Thank you so much for having me, really.